One June day, 31-year-old Brenda Delgado got a bummer email from her ex-boyfriend, Ricky. She and Ricky Paniagua had met in August of 2012, and within 3 months of dating, the two had moved in together. Ricky was a doctor who'd graduated from Stanford and moved to Dallas to complete his residency in dermatology. Brenda was a dental hygiene student. It was a match made in med school heaven. The 38-year-old had even given Brenda a promise ring, and aside from one brief breakup, the couple had been inseparable for about 2.5 years. But in February of 2015, Ricky was no longer feeling the spark and told Brenda that he needed to move on. Brenda was devastated and watched as Ricky started to put himself out there and dip his toes back into the dating world with much success. He eventually started dating this new girl, and the two had made it official, which was the reason he sent the bummer email that June. In the email, he informed Brenda politely that he was in a new relationship and it was going really well. Which seems kind of weird and formal, but I guess that's a doctor for you. Very considerate of him though, no shade. His new girlfriend was a 35-year-old pediatric dentist named Kendra Hatcher. Kendra was head over heels for Ricky, and the dentist and the doctor were enamored with each other. That whole summer, Kendra and Ricky ate out at fancy restaurants, took extravagant vacations, and posted photos on Facebook, often with their arms wrapped tightly around each other, hopelessly smitten. The two eventually started a wedding fund and began putting away money for their dream day. Tragically, their plans of wedded bliss would be shattered on September 2nd, when Kendra's life was cut short in a horrendous way. She was getting ready to leave for a trip to Cancun with Ricky when someone walked up to her in the parking garage of her apartment and fired a round into the back of her head. The town was shocked. Co-workers and friends were devastated, and young women no longer felt safe to walk the uptown Dallas area at night. A vigil was held for Kendra near the entrance to the parking garage, and people mourned their beloved friend and coworker who didn't seem to have an enemy in the world. Well, at least not an enemy she was aware of. Kendra's tan Coach purse was missing, and the cops suspected that she'd been the victim of a robbery, but within a week, their theory took an unexpected turn. After a bit of sleuthing, the detectives began to believe that Kendra had been the victim of a hitman who'd been hired to take out Kendra by none other than Ricky's ex, Brenda Delgado. Detectives had learned that since the breakup, Brenda had been stalking Ricky, had quite literally been tailing him all around Dallas, and still had access to his texts and emails. She went from green with jealousy to a literal green-eyed monster. When Brenda realized that Ricky was starting to fall for Kendra, she absolutely lost it, and authorities discovered she'd hired 2 people she barely knew to take her out. One was a single mother struggling to make ends meet, and the other was a small-time MJ dealer, and both were willing to do the deed for a little bit of cash. Yeah, girly, he's really gonna take you back after you ruin his life like that. Like what? But when authorities looked for Brenda to talk to her, she was gone. The detectives met with the FBI, and Brenda actually ended up on their 10 most wanted fugitives list. A $100,000 reward was set up for information that could lead to Brenda's arrest. The FBI also warned to not approach her if they spotted her, because they really didn't know what sort of mental state she was going to be in. But Brenda's family insisted the police had it all wrong. They said Brenda would never devise any sort of plan to commit a crime, and that this was the detectives grasping at straws for a motive. They maintained that Brenda was a good person, a Christian, and was not the jealous type. I think they'd be amazed to hear just how many of the monsters we cover on this show also are followers of Jesus. It's become a running theme here. Brenda's family hired a well-regarded Dallas attorney to represent her, who declared she had never been in trouble before, had no history of mental illness, and was incapable of violence. Not even Ricky could imagine Brenda would do this. Since their breakup, he said they remained good friends. In fact, on the night of Kendra's attack, Ricky texted Brenda to let her know what happened, and the next morning he got a text from her offering to bring him groceries and help him out in any way he needed. Ricky was baffled and told the police he didn't think it was possible that someone so kind and genuinely sweet could transform into this Mr. Hyde character overnight, and explained their history together. When Ricky needed his car repaired in July, Brenda dropped him off at the shop, was perfectly pleasant to Ricky, and didn't mention their breakup. She made it clear that if ever he needed her, she was happy to help. Can you understand how Ricky really didn't believe Brenda was behind it? She was so good at putting on her Dr. Jekyll persona and keeping Mr. Hyde, well, hidden. But despite the facade she put on around Ricky, at night, Brenda sat alone in her apartment, stalking his Facebook, stalking Kendra's Facebook, and realizing she would never be her. Ricky took Kendra on extravagant trips and vacations, something he never did with Brenda. She saw Kendra wearing an "I'm with Dreamy" shirt while they posed at dinner and took a screenshot. One night, Brenda went on a date with a guy named Roberto, who was seriously interested in her. That is, until she spent the entire date talking about her ex-boyfriend and his new girlfriend. Later, she asked Roberto to take her to visit a friend and had him park outside of Kendra's apartment complex. Roberto said he thought maybe they were gonna have a little smooch session in the car, but he was sorely mistaken when she spent the entire evening looking out the windshield searching for someone. Another guy who'd gone to high school with Brenda took her out to dinner, and he also said Ricky and Kendra were all she could talk about. He was alarmed at one point during dinner when she asked him out of the blue if he knew of anyone willing to hurt someone, and he told her that whatever she was thinking of, to drop it. But unfortunately, she couldn't just drop it. She was in a deep downward spiral, and paired with some probably undiagnosed mental illnesses, Brenda was heading for a disaster of massive proportions. When her cousin Moses wanted to meet up with her for drinks, she showed up with a metal baseball bat, offering to buy him a car or pay his child support if he threatened Kendra with it. Moses thought Brenda was and didn't take her seriously. So then she turned her sights on a friend named Jennifer Escobar, who she'd met while working at the mall. Brenda knew Jennifer was going through some financial trouble and offered to let her move in with her. But the second she did, it was all Ricky and Kendra all the time, and Jennifer found herself making excuses to get away from the apartment and Brenda. Brenda offered to buy Jennifer substances or a car if she would help her get revenge on Ricky and Kendra. Revenge for moving on and finding love together? Yeah, how dare they? Then Brenda started bringing up the baseball bat and mentioned knocking Ricky into a coma. And I understand the whole "it's not my business" mentality, but guys, come on, could not one person have maybe tipped off the authorities or her family or Ricky and Kendra? This is now like 3 people that Brenda has specifically gone to and stated intention to harm someone, and everyone's just like, dang, don't do that, lol. When Brenda started mentioning wanting to harm Kendra as well, Jennifer finally noped right out of there. As soon as she did, Brenda approached one of Jennifer's friends, a 23-year-old single mother named Crystal Cortez, who was struggling to financially support her young son. Brenda regularly took Crystal to dinner and paid for her meals while retelling her tales of relationship woe. One night while at dinner, Brenda offered Crystal $500 to help her eliminate Kendra. Crystal, who had never been in trouble with the law before, agreed. Wow, first time for everything, am I right? No, unfortunately, the reasons she agreed were a lot more tragic. Crystal explained to investigators that she agreed to help a woman she barely knew off another woman she didn't know because she was broke and had a son to support. Ugh. For a few days, Brenda and Crystal tailed Kendra around Dallas and even used night vision binoculars to spy on her. But when the two realized that they both didn't have experience with firearms, they decided they needed to hire a hitman who did. So they drove around Crystal's neighborhood and asked a bunch of random men if they'd be willing to pop someone for money. Oof, this is starting to sound like the Charity Payne case a little bit. She offered to buy him a weapon and pay him with a combination of cash that totaled to around $3,000, and Christopher accepted and told them he had his own .40 caliber. Brenda wanted the hit to be done on September 2nd, the day before Kendra and Ricky were supposed to leave for Cancun, because after that, the two were planning to move across the country together, and she felt this was her final chance. Brenda and Crystal borrowed their friend Jose's black Jeep Cherokee, and Crystal dropped Brenda off at the public library to study with a friend for her alibi. Crystal then picked up Christopher and parked across the street from the Smile Zone where Kendra was working. The two sat all day watching Kendra's white Toyota Camry, but at around 2:30, Crystal told Christopher she had to pick her son up from school. So she dropped him back off at his apartment, got in the carpool line at school, picked up her son, and got him a corn dog at Sonic, dropped him off at his grandmother's, then went back to get Christopher and returned back to Smile Zone. Kendra was still there, finished work early that evening, and drove home, followed by Christopher and Crystal. I'm also realizing how similar some of these names are. We've got a Brenda, Kendra, Christopher, and Crystal. It's kind of wild, huh? Okay, sorry, back to the story. Kendra lost them in traffic and stopped by a friend's house to borrow a waterproof camera for her trip, then arrived back at her complex's parking garage where Crystal and Christopher were waiting for her. As soon as she pulled in, Christopher got out of the car and swiftly walked towards Kendra's Camry. Just as she stepped out of the car, he raised the pistol and fired, grabbing her Coach purse and hurrying back to the Jeep. The two sped off, leaving Kendra's body lying on the floor of the garage. At that exact same time, Brenda was getting drinks at Chili's with one of her classmates, Jose, who'd given her a ride from the library and was also the guy who'd let her borrow his black Jeep Cherokee. They returned to Jose's place after 9, and Brenda called Crystal to confirm the task had been completed. Ugh. Crystal drove to Jose's so they could swap cars and return the Jeep, and as they did, Brenda triumphantly grabbed Kendra's purse and slung it over her shoulder. When the police interviewed Ricky that night, he didn't even name Brenda as a potential suspect. He texted her that night to tell her what happened, and Brenda played the role of the concerned friend with sociopathic ease. The detectives only had one lead to go off of in the case so far, and that was the grainy surveillance footage of a woman driving the black Jeep Cherokee out of the parking garage. They decided to release the footage to the media, and when Jose saw it, he called Brenda in a panic. Brenda quickly explained her friend Crystal had driven the Cherokee most of the day and that she thought she had addiction problems and maybe was in a deal gone wrong. Oh, nice. Jose told her he was afraid to drive the Jeep in the area, and she suggested he painted it a different color and never talk about what happened to anyone. Oh, real nice. But Jose talked it over with his family and agreed to go to the authorities with the information he had, and the detectives quickly contacted Ricky, who was in shock, and informed them that Brenda was stopping by that day to drop off some groceries. Brenda was quickly brought in for questioning, where she asked authorities how her name had come up in the investigation. She told them that her relationship with Ricky hadn't been that serious, and that she wasn't too upset when they broke up. She claimed that she didn't even know what Ricky's new girlfriend's name was. They asked her to tell them her whereabouts on the day of the attack, and she mentioned the library and Chili's, but never about going to Jose's. She said her friend, Crystal, dropped her off at the library that morning and picked her up that night at Chili's. Then she pulled out the neatly folded Chili's receipt from her wallet to prove it. You know, how any normal person would perfectly preserve a 3-day-old receipt from a random trip to Chili's. At the same time, Crystal Cortez was being questioned in the next room, where she confirmed she had driven the Jeep into the parking garage that night, but told several different stories as to why she was there. First, she claimed she was looking for somewhere to park for a nearby restaurant. Then she said she was with her son that day and parked there so she could take him to play at the park nearby. And finally, she claimed a man named Lamar, who she didn't know, forced her at gunpoint to drive him into the garage to rob Kendra. Crystal agreed to take a plea deal for 35 years in prison if she gave testimony about the roles she, Brenda, and Christopher played in the crimes against Kendra Hatcher. Christopher Love was tried first in October of 2018, and after hearing Crystal's testimony, it took the jurors only 2 hours to sentence him to lethal injection. Brenda didn't say a word as she was sentenced, and was escorted out of the room through a side door. In one final attempt, she stopped in the doorway and turned around to look back at where Ricky had once been sitting, but he was already gone. She dropped her eyes, turned back around, and she too was gone.